Imagine, if you will, that you're just sitting comfortably in the passenger seat of a car. You're securely buckled in. The person driving has their hands perfectly positioned, at 10 and 2.
Right, doing everything totally by the book.
Exactly, completely by the book. They're meticulously using their turn signals well in advance of every maneuver. They're coming to a complete, really gentle stop at every single red light. They yield politely at every crosswalk, and they're maintaining the exact posted speed limit down to the decimal.
So an absolutely perfect driver.
Right. They are, by all accounts, following every single rule of the road to the letter. There is absolutely zero deviation from the established, legal protocol of driving.
Mhm.
But there's one massive glaring problem.
And what's that?
Through the windshield, you can see quite clearly that the road you're currently on is heading straight off a jagged cliff.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. So here is the question for you to chew on today. Do you politely stay buckled in, your hands folded neatly in your lap because the driver is following the rules and, well, those are the rules? Or do you reach over, grab the steering wheel, forcefully hijack control of the vehicle, and literally run the car off the road into a ditch to avoid the drop?
I mean, it's a visceral, almost terrifying psychological scenario, right? And it perfectly isolates the fundamental tension that we're attempting to unravel today.
It really does.
Because we are so deeply, almost cellularly conditioned to believe that following the rules equates to doing the moral thing. We conflate legality with morality all the time.
Right, since we were kids.
Exactly. But in the scenario you just described, the rules are actively facilitating a catastrophe. The framework of order is acting as like a conveyor belt toward destruction.
Right, it's forcing a complete rupture between being a rule follower and being a survivor.
Precisely. Or, when we scale this up to a broader societal context, it forces a rupture between mere compliance and actual moral integrity.
And that rupture is the core mission of our deep dive today. We are pulling from a really dense stack of philosophical and political source material to examine a profoundly uncomfortable reality. Like what happens when injustice isn't just an accident or a glitch in the system.
But when it's built in.
Right, when it's built right into the architecture of the law itself, we're looking at those historical and contemporary moments when the legal system is the very engine driving the car off the cliff.
Yeah, and in those spaces, the question shifts from this, theoretical debate in a classroom to a strict, practical imperative.
Which is whether breaking the law, engaging in civil disobedience, is just an admirable, heroic choice that a few brave people make, or, under the right conditions, does it actually become a strict, binding moral duty for everyone?
And the stakes of this inquiry, I mean, they honestly could not be higher. From the moment we are socialized as children, the virtues of obedience are just drilled into us.
Oh, absolutely.
We're taught to obey laws, to respect institutional authority, to wait our turn in line, and to seek peaceful change exclusively through the proper sanctioned channels.
Always use your inside voice.
Right, exactly. And we have to acknowledge that there is highly rational, functional reason for that conditioning. That baseline of universal compliance is the only thing that brings order and stability and predictability to our daily lives.
And public trust.
Yes, public trust. We absolutely need that infrastructure to function as a society. But the philosophical texts we're examining today, they force us to stare directly at the dark side of that same compliance.
We have to confront what happens when a perfectly ordered, mathematically precise legal system is explicitly engineered to protect, say, systemic corruption.
Or colonial domination.
Or the violent repression of a minority group. Right. What if the rules of the road are actively designed to run certain people over while giving others a smooth ride? Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think to truly understand why deliberately breaking the law might ever be morally required, to grasp the sheer gravity of disobedience, we have to start by completely respecting the moral weight of obedience.
Yeah, that's crucial.
We can't understand the heavy burden of breaking the rules until we thoroughly map out why following them holds such immense moral value in the first place.
That is the necessary starting point. The philosophical consensus here is that before we can even entertain the concept of disobedience as a duty, we have to establish the massive moral presumption in favor of the law.
The default setting, basically.
Exactly. The law normally deserves our obedience, and the texts isolate three distinct compounding reasons for this. And the first, and perhaps most foundational, is simply that law makes shared human life possible.
Let's dig into that because, I mean, it sounds almost insultingly basic on the surface, but it's actually the bedrock of the entire social contract.
It is the bedrock. If you strip away the legal framework, you don't just get a fun, freewheeling, libertarian utopia, right?
Wait, it's not a block party.
No, historically and philosophically, you risk descending into a state of perpetual fear, instability, and arbitrary violence. Without a universally recognized mechanism to define rights and resolve disputes, there is massive, paralyzing confusion about what duties we actually owe to one another.
The law coordinates our social existence.
It creates a shared reality. It tells us which side of the road to drive on, how property is transferred, and, critically, what constitutes harm.
So because it provides that indispensable baseline of safety and social coordination, the texts argue that this function alone generates a prima facie reason to obey it.
Right, a first sight reason. You have an immediate, baseline moral obligation to support the thing that keeps society from devouring itself.
So just by virtue of the fact that it prevents us from living in a chaotic, terrifying free-for-all where the strongest person just takes whatever they want, the law earns a default level of deference.
Yeah.
It earns the benefit of the doubt, even when it isn't perfect.
Precisely. And the second reason builds on that, specifically within the context of democratic legitimacy.
Okay, how so?
Well, in a functioning democratic system, laws carry a unique kind of moral weight because they aren't merely arbitrary decrees handed down by a monarch or, a military junta. They're the product of public institutions.
There's an architecture of representation.
Exactly. There are established procedures that citizens can theoretically influence through participation, debate, and consensus. The law represents a collective compromise.
But let me interrupt and play devil's advocate here. Push back on that framework a bit.
Go for it.
If we accept that a democratic system has these built-in structural avenues for change, like if we have the mechanism of voting, of petitioning, of running for office, doesn't the act of deliberately breaking the law completely invalidate the democratic experiment?
That's the core fear, yeah.
Right, because if I lose a vote on a policy and my response is to just go break the law anyway, aren't I just acting like a tyrant with no power? Aren't we reducing society to an a la carte menu where everyone just picks and chooses which rules apply to them based on their personal preferences?
What's fascinating here is that is the exact paradox the philosophers wrestle with. And it brings us directly to the third reason for obedience, which is the overarching danger of generalized disobedience.
Yeah, the slippery slope.
Exactly. If we universalize the premise that anyone can break any law the moment they personally deem it unjust, the entire concept of the rule of law collapses, we'd slide into mutual distrust.
Because obedience would become entirely selective.
Completely selective, based purely on individual convenience or subjective morality, which leads to the complete erosion of public order. You just cannot maintain a complex society if adherence to the law is entirely voluntary on a case-by-case basis.
Right, because my subjective definition of justice might involve aggressively redistributing your property. And your subjective definition of justice might involve violently suppressing my speech.
Exactly.
If we both feel completely justified in breaking the laws that stop us from doing those things, the whole structure burns down.
And that terrifying prospect, that very real slide into societal dissolution, is why the sources emphasize that the moral hurdle for civil disobedience is astronomically high. Breaking the law is never a casual, flippant choice.
You really have to earn it.
You do. To justify stepping outside the legal order, you have to overcome this massive, compounded moral presumption in favor of maintaining stability.
I think this is a critical moment for you, the listener, to just pause and interrogate your own daily compliance. Think about your routine today. When you stop at a red light at 3 a.m. when the streets are completely deserted, or when you truthfully fill out your tax returns, how much of that compliance is rooted in a deep philosophical agreement with the moral righteousness of the traffic code or the tax law?
Probably not much.
Right. And how much of it is simply a desire for predictability, order, and avoiding the friction of state punishment? We subconsciously rely on that predictability to function. We need to know the other cars will stop at the red light, which makes the deliberate, calculated act of shattering that predictability such a profound intervention.
It is a profound rupture of the social contract. And because overcoming that massive presumption of obedience is such a heavy burden, the act of breaking the law can't just be random, chaotic, or impulsive.
It has to have rules of its own.
Exactly. It requires a highly specific, rigorous, and disciplined structure. It has to be surgically precise to be considered true civil disobedience.
It makes me think of the physical mechanics of pulling the emergency brake on a passenger train.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. When you pull that lever, you are engaging in a highly disruptive, inherently violent act against the momentum of the system. It's entirely public. Everyone on the train gets thrown forward, the alarms blare, the journey halts.
And you're definitely getting in trouble.
Exactly. With absolute certainty that you are going to face severe consequences. The conductor is going to march down that aisle and demand to know who jeopardized the entire transit system. But you pull it anyway because you see an obstruction on the tracks ahead that the conductor's limited vantage point missed.
You're trying to force a crisis to prevent a catastrophic derailment.
Yes, you're purposefully breaking the normal operation to save the integrity of the whole system.
I want to lean into that mechanical analogy because it perfectly illustrates the distinction the sources make. The texts are meticulous in defining exactly what this act is, primarily by isolating what it is not.
Okay, what is it not?
Well, civil disobedience is fundamentally distinct from ordinary crime. Ordinary crime is almost always self-serving. It's done for personal gain, and crucially, it relies on evasion. The criminal wants to exploit the system without being detected.
They want to get away with it.
Right. Civil disobedience, conversely, is defined as a public, deliberate, conscientious, and political breach of the law.
Let's dissect the friction within those specific features, starting with the requirement that it must be public. Why is the theatricality of it so essential? Like, if a law is genuinely unjust, why can't I just secretly evade it to protect myself or my community? Why do I have to stand in the town square and announce that I'm breaking it?
Because secret evasion, even for highly moral reasons, doesn't challenge the system itself. It only protects the individual.
Oh, I see.
The public nature of civil disobedience is what transforms it from an act of personal survival into an act of societal communication. By breaking the law in the light of day, the actor is deliberately drawing the gaze of the state and the public.
They're forcing the community to witness the enforcement of the unjust law.
Exactly. It's a demand to be seen and a demand that the society reckon with what it is actively doing.
That raises a fascinating edge case, though. Let's stress test that with something modern, like whistleblowing. Think of Edward Snowden.
Oh, that's a perfect test case.
He didn't stand in a public square to steal the NSA documents. He did it in absolute secrecy, violating his clearance and the law. But then, he publicly attached his name to the leak, revealing his identity to the world. So, does the secrecy of the acquisition disqualify it as civil disobedience, or does the public revelation satisfy the requirement?
Philosophers actually actively debate this exact tension, but the consensus tends to lean toward classifying acts like Snowden's as civil disobedience, because the ultimate intent and the crucial phase of the act, the revelation, were intensely public and aimed at political reform.
So the initial secrecy was just a logistical necessity to secure the information.
Right, but the moral weight of the act rested entirely on his public disclosure and his willingness to own the breach, which transitions seamlessly into the next two features. The act must be conscientious and political.
And we have to separate conscientious from mere ego or personal grievance, right?
Absolutely. Conscientious means the breach is driven by a profound, carefully considered moral conviction, not vanity, not a desire to build a personal brand, and certainly not for financial advantage.
The person breaking the law genuinely believes the statute itself is morally bankrupt or actively protects a moral wrong.
Exactly. And the political requirement means the act is inherently outward-facing. It's aimed at changing laws, policies, or institutions for the collective good. It's an appeal to the political community to recognize a systemic failure and to correct it, rather than, an attempt to settle a private score.
But here is where we hit the most profound paradox of the entire concept. The final defining feature of civil disobedience is the willingness to accept the legal consequences.
Right, this is the big one.
By accepting the arrest, the trial, the jail time, aren't you essentially validating the authority of the very system you are claiming is unjust? I mean, why submit to the punishment of a corrupt mechanism?
That paradox is the absolute genius of the strategy, really. By willingly submitting to the penalty, by literally letting the police put the handcuffs on, by sitting in the jail cell, the actor is demonstrating a profound, almost excruciating respect for the broader concept of the rule of law.
They are cleaving the system in two.
Yes. They're saying to the state, I believe in the necessity of law. I believe in the social contract of the society, which is why I am surrendering my body to your jurisdiction. but I am simultaneously exposing this one specific, localized application of your power as fundamentally illegitimate.
They aren't trying to burn down the courthouse. They're just refusing to obey one deeply flawed ruling inside it, and they're using their own punishment to highlight the flaw.
Exactly.
Think about the Greensboro sit-ins during the American Civil Rights Movement. Those students didn't just walk into the Woolworths and quietly eat a sandwich. They hijacked the economic and social mechanics of that segregated space to force a crisis.
And they knew they would be arrested.
Right. The arrest wasn't a failure of the protests. The arrest was the mechanism of the protest. The image of peaceful students being dragged out by armed police was the exact friction needed to show the entire country the inherent violence of segregation.
That historical example perfectly embodies the synthesis of these concepts. When you combine the public exposure, the moral conviction, the political aim, and the disciplined acceptance of the penalty, you arrive at the defining description offered by the source material. Civil disobedience is lawbreaking used as moral speech.
Law-breaking used as moral speech. That is powerful. It takes an action that society inherently views as destructive, shattering a rule, and chemically alters it into a desperately needed form of dialogue.
It's communication through disruption.
It is the only dialogue left when all sanctioned forms of talking have been systematically muted. Which brings us to the next massive threshold. If we have rigorously defined what the act is, and we understand how incredibly high the burden of proof is to justify shattering the peace, we have to examine the precise real-world conditions that actually justify pulling that emergency brake.
Because you don't pull the brake just because the dining car ran out of your favorite coffee, right?
The disruption has to be proportionate to a massive failure. So when does it become morally defensible to cause that chaos?
Well, the justification is grounded in one inescapable, often terrifying philosophical truth. Legality does not in any way guarantee morality.
That is a bitter pill for a modern, institutionalized society to swallow.
Oh, totally.
We desperately want to believe that the legislative process filters out evil. We want to believe that if something is codified into law, it possesses an inherent rightness.
We really want the comfort of that alignment, but history completely shatters that illusion. The texts force us to remember that the most horrific atrocities in human history were not illegal. They were meticulously lawful.
Chattel slavery was protected by complex legal frameworks.
Yes. Apartheid was a highly structured, legally enforced system. The suppression of women's rights, the criminalization of LGBTQ identities, the persecution of indigenous populations, the Jim Crow laws, all of these were not aberrations of the law. They were the law of the land.
They were actively enforced by judges, police, and bureaucrats who were, by all accounts, just following the rules.
The driver was following the exact speed limit while steering the car perfectly off the cliff. And because of this glaring historical reality, the philosophical consensus is that obedience to a legal system is not owed simply because the rules are written down in a leather-bound book. A rational moral agent can look at a legally codified injustice and correctly conclude, I do not owe my obedience to this violence simply because a legislature voted for it.
But I want to play the role of the institutionalist skeptic here.
Okay, let's hear it.
The person who says, okay, I can see the law is currently flawed, but we live in a democracy, not a dictatorship. Why not just wait for the system to correct itself? Why introduce the chaos of law-breaking instead of just organizing a better campaign, voting in new representatives, or, funding better litigation?
Yeah.
Doesn't the arc of the moral universe bend toward justice on its own?
The fatal flaw in that institutionalist logic is the assumption that the arc of the moral universe bends autonomously. It doesn't.
It only bends because people physically pull it down.
Exactly. And the texts detail two very specific structural realities where waiting for the system to fix itself becomes morally indefensible. The first is when normal political channels are either fully blocked or dangerously slow.
Blocked in what sense?
Yeah.
Like structurally blocked so that change is mathematically impossible.
Yes, through mechanisms like extreme gerrymandering, regulatory capture by corporate interests, or systemic voter suppression, institutions can become utterly captured by power, effectively immunizing themselves against any reform that threatens the status quo.
So in those environments, telling an oppressed group to just vote harder is basically gaslighting.
That's exactly what it is. The ordinary political channels are an illusion designed to absorb and neutralize dissent. And even if the channels aren't completely blocked, the texts point out the temporal reality of suffering.
Meaning the time it takes to fix it.
Right. If the injustice is immediate and severe, telling people to wait for the slow, decades-long grind of the legislative process means you are accepting that thousands more will be harmed, their rights will be permanently denied, and their suffering will become the accepted baseline of society.
You're normalizing the suffering. That is the most insidious part. The idea that if a society just waits long enough, the cruelty just becomes the background radiation of everyday life.
Which leads directly into the second justification for disobedience, the urgent necessity to reveal hidden injustice. Unjust systems do not survive on constant visible violence. They survive on routine, they rely on silence, they rely on what the sources describe as moral numbness.
Moral numbness. It's like the hum of the refrigerator. You don't even hear it until someone unplugs it.
That is the perfect analogy. Civil disobedience is the deliberate act of interrupting that hum. It dramatizes the hidden violence. It forces a society that has become comfortably numb to suddenly look at the gears of the machine they are operating.
By breaking the routine, the disobedient actors are declaring, this current order is not a morally neutral state of nature. It is an active mechanism of harm that requires our daily cooperation, and we are withdrawing our cooperation.
Yes.
You know, the text has a phrase for this that just stopped me in my tracks. It calls civil disobedience conscience made visible.
Such a great phrase.
It makes me think of a scenario where you live in an apartment and the tenant below you has a band that practices at 3 a.m. You can try to fill out the noise complaint paperwork with the city. You can try to slip a polite note under their door. You can even stand in their living room and try to yell over the music.
But they can't hear you.
Right. The music is so deafening, the system of their noise is so absolute that they literally cannot hear you complaining. Your polite institutional resistance is completely absorbed by their volume. Sometimes the only physical way to make your conscience visible, the only way to force an actual dialogue, is to walk over to the amplifier and rip the power cord out of the wall.
You have to force the silence to make them look at you. The sudden absence of the noise creates the space where you can finally point to the problem. The disruption isn't the end goal. The disruption creates the arena for the moral argument to finally take place.
So if we trace our path so far, we have established the stringent definition of the act, and we've established the conditions under which breaking the law transitions from being a crime to being a morally justified, defensible choice.
Yes, but we are about to cross a massive philosophical threshold.
Right, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the source material doesn't just stop at justified.
It pushes significantly further into much more demanding territory.
It's one thing to look at a protester and say, what they are doing is an admirable choice, I respect their bravery. It is an entirely different, vastly heavier philosophical claim to say that breaking the law is a strict moral duty.
Right, an obligation.
To say that under certain conditions you are not just allowed to disobey, you are morally required to do so. How do the sources justify crossing that line from permissible choice to absolute obligation?
Well, the texts construct three major interlocking arguments for when civil disobedience shifts into a binding moral duty. And the first, and arguably the most confrontational, is the complicity argument.
The reality that your hands are getting dirty whether you acknowledge it or not.
Exactly. The premise here is that if a law or a structural institution demands your direct participation in something gravely unjust, you have an affirmative moral duty to refuse cooperation.
Like what?
The texts use stark historical examples: being required by law to enforce segregation policies, being ordered as a civil servant to betray the locations of vulnerable refugees, or participating in the systematic economic exclusion of a minority group.
So the trigger for the duty isn't just that a bad law exists somewhere out in the ether. The trigger is that the bad law is actively forcing you to be the physical instrument of the injustice.
Yes. The philosophical argument is that you are fundamentally not allowed to keep your conscience clean privately, while your body publicly cooperates with an unjust system. You can't hide behind the defense of, well, I personally find this abhorrent, but it's my job, or I vehemently disagree with this policy, but it's the law, so my hands are tied.
If your obedience is the very mechanism that makes the oppression possible, your disobedience is no longer optional. It is the baseline requirement of moral integrity.
Exactly.
It's the bouncer analogy. Imagine you are hired as a bouncer at an exclusive club, and on your first night, the manager hands you a highly discriminatory, blatantly racist entry policy. If you stand at that velvet rope, checking IDs and turning people away based on that racist metric, you cannot mentally retreat into your own head and tell yourself, Well, I am just neutrally observing the discrimination. I don't personally harbor these prejudices, so I am innocent.
You're not an observer at that point.
No. In that moment, you are not an observer. You are the door itself. You are the physical barrier enforcing the racism. You have an absolute moral duty to step aside and refuse the order.
Yes.
But I have to push back on this on behalf of the listener. Because while the bouncer analogy is neat and direct, modern complicity is rarely that visible.
That's true.
Does this complicity argument imply that you, the listener, sitting in your car or drinking your coffee right now, are actively complicit in the global injustices of your society simply by existing within its borders?
Oh, I see you're going.
Just by paying taxes to a government that funds unjust wars, or by buying a smartphone built on supply chains that utilize coerced labor? Do we all carry this constant, exhausting, universal duty to be breaking the law every single day just to avoid complicity?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if we scale the theory to that extreme, it collapses under its own weight, and the philosophers recognize that. The answer is no. It is not a blanket universal duty for every single person to act at all times.
Okay, that's a relief.
To clarify this, the texts introduce the positional argument. This argument fundamentally states that your moral duty to resist is intricately tied to your specific position within the system.
Okay, so the weight of the obligation scales based on where you are physically and socially standing.
Precisely. The duty to disobey is significantly stronger for the individuals who directly witness the injustice up close, or those who are explicitly asked to enforce it, like your bouncer. But the positional argument extends much further into the realm of privilege.
How so?
It asserts that those who hold public office, those who possess significant cultural or economic influence, or those who enjoy relative safety from police violence, have a vastly higher obligation to disobey.
Because they have more padding.
Exactly. If you are specifically positioned to resist effectively, if you have the social capital to weather an arrest, the financial safety net to lose a job, or the platform to guarantee the protests will be seen, your moral duty to disrupt an unjust system is exponentially greater than the duty of someone who is undocumented, highly vulnerable, and has zero margin for error.
That reframes the entire concept. The duty doesn't fall equally on everyone's shoulders like a flat tax. It's a progressive moral tax. If you are deeply insulated from the worst consequences of the system, your obligation to use your body to protect those who are crushed by the system goes up.
It is a profound acknowledgement of power dynamics, and that leads directly into the third pillar of the duty framework, the silence argument.
Doing nothing.
Right. This argument posits that there are critical situations where simply doing nothing is an active form of maintenance for the oppression.
It calls to mind that old, somewhat cliché, but undeniably true quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing."
It is cliché because it is structurally accurate. The philosophical texts argue that if a majority of citizens adopt a stance of passive disagreement, if everyone says, I agree the law is terrible, but someone else should take the risk to resist it, or I just don't want to cause trouble for my family, then the injustice continues completely uninterrupted. Therefore, when confronted with severe systemic injustice, your moral duty is not merely a negative duty to avoid doing the wrong thing yourself. You have an affirmative, positive duty not to quietly allow the wrong to continue through your passive acquiescence.
Saying, I don't want to cause trouble is essentially translating to, I am perfectly comfortable with the trouble falling exclusively on someone else.
That is the harsh, uncompromising mirror the text holds up to society. This argument fundamentally strips civil disobedience of its romantic extra credit aura and repositions it as a baseline civic responsibility.
But wait, let's look at the sheer volatility of what we've just established. If the texts are arguing that silence is active complicity and that privilege exponentially increases your duty to act, it sounds like every middle-class citizen should be out in the streets pulling the emergency brake on society every single day.
Right, a state of constant protest.
We should all be permanently chained to the gears of the machine. But doesn't that immediately invite the exact anarchic chaos the texts warned us about in the very first segment? How do we stop this from devolving into constant, destabilizing warfare over every political disagreement?
That tension is exactly why the philosophers construct a very rigorous set of guardrails. They make a highly compelling case against invoking the language of duty too easily or too broadly.
So what does this all mean? Are we all supposed to go get arrested tomorrow?
No, definitely not. If we blindly accept the premise that everyone has an absolute, unyielding duty to break unjust laws constantly, we're either demanding superhuman martyrdom or we're inviting complete societal collapse.
We need the guardrails to ensure the train stays on the tracks while we're debating exactly when and how to pull the brake.
We do. And the first major caution the texts raise is the profound reality of cost and risk. We cannot sit in an ivory tower and theorize about a universal duty to disobey without deeply acknowledging the very real, often violent cost that disobedience extracts from the individual.
The actual consequences.
Yes. The sources list the potential consequences quite starkly. Arrest, physical beatings, permanent job loss, the destruction of family stability, exile, and, in many global regimes, execution.
These are just abstract variables in a philosophical equation.
Yeah.
These are life-destroying, flesh and blood realities.
They are devastating. And because the costs are so high, the sources argue that it is profoundly unfair and perhaps morally obtuse to declare that every single person is strictly required to take on extreme personal risks.
It's not a one-size-fits-all expectation.
Exactly. They use a stark comparison to illustrate this. A tenured professor or a wealthy student protesting on an elite university campus in a liberal democracy faces vastly different risk than a working-class citizen trying to resist a brutal militarized dictatorship where dissent means your family disappears in the night.
The cost of the ticket to enter the protest is completely different based on your geography and your status.
Exactly. So if civil disobedience is ever to be considered a true moral duty, it must be highly elastic and deeply sensitive to context. It must ruthlessly weigh the potential cost, the inherent vulnerability of the specific person acting, and the broader political environment they are operating within. You cannot construct a moral philosophy that demands martyrdom as its baseline requirement.
That adds a necessary layer of grace and empathy back into the equation. It stops it from being this rigid, unforgiving moral calculator that condemns anyone who is too afraid or too vulnerable to risk their livelihood.
The second massive guardrail the text provides is the mandate to exhaust alternative channels. Not every injustice, even serious ones, requires the immediate weaponization of lawbreaking.
Right, going back to the train analogy, we don't shatter the glass and pull the emergency brake just because the dining car is out of coffee or because the train is running 10 minutes late.
You don't. The texts emphasize that before an individual resorts to breaking the law, they have an obligation to attempt, or at least seriously evaluate, the ordinary avenues of change.
Like what?
Organizing grassroots movements, aggressive voter registration, deep investigative journalism, relentless litigation in the appellate courts, targeted labor strikes, and rigorous public debate. These are the vital, stabilizing tools of a healthy society.
So you have to try the normal doors before you kick a hole in the wall.
Yes. Civil disobedience should only be invoked when those normal channels are demonstrably blocked, when the urgency of the harm outpaces the speed of the courts, or, as we discussed earlier, when the law is directly demanding your physical complicity in a wrong.
So it truly operates as the tool of last resort, or perhaps more accurately, the tool you are forced to use when all the other tools have been confiscated, broken, or rigged by the powerful.
Yes. And the final, perhaps most crucial guardrail is what the philosophers term the recklessness risk. This is essential for maintaining the actual moral integrity of the entire concept.
Okay, what is the recklessness risk?
Well, if society begins to dilute the term, if people start calling every intense political disagreement or every minor regulatory inconvenience a moral duty to disobey, the concept is entirely hollowed out.
It just becomes a grandiloquent excuse to do whatever you want and rebrand your selfishness as heroism.
It devolves rapidly into ego-driven defiance. It becomes a culture of selective, highly convenient obedience, where citizens just ignore the laws they find annoying, like paying taxes for programs they dislike or following public health mandates, and loudly claim they are noble dissidents.
Which doesn't lead to justice.
No, that leads to destabilizing, chaotic acts utterly devoid of discipline or conscience. The language of moral duty is incredibly potent, and the sources issue a stern warning that it must be guarded fiercely, lest it become a weaponized justification for mere recklessness.
I think that is a vital grounding warning against the romanticization of disobedience. We consume media, we watch historical biopics, and acts of civil disobedience are usually portrayed with swelling orchestral music, slow-motion montages, and inevitable victory.
It's always so cinematic.
But in reality, it isn't an action movie. It carries real, sometimes permanent, devastating human costs. And it requires a level of psychological and tactical discipline that is the exact opposite of just throwing a tantrum in public because a policy didn't go your way.
That profound discipline is the only thing that separates a morally strong refusal from a mere riot or an act of rebellion. And because the stakes of that distinction are so high and the danger of recklessness is ever present, the source texts conclude by providing a highly specific, rigorous checklist of conditions.
They build an anatomy of a morally defensible refusal.
Exactly.
Okay, let's walk through this anatomy. If someone is standing at the edge of this precipice, staring down a law they believe is profoundly unjust, and they're feeling the heavy gravitational pull of moral duty, what specific conditions must be met for their lawbreaking to be philosophically and morally defensible?
The first non-negotiable condition is that the injustice in question must be exceptionally serious. We are not talking about administrative annoyances, minor tax code frustrations, or zoning disputes. We are talking about tangible, undeniable violations of fundamental human dignity, systemic inequality, the stripping of voting rights, or grave threats to physical safety.
It has to be the car heading off an actual cliff, not just hitting a patch of rough road.
Correct. Second, the act itself must be genuinely conscientious. It must be anchored in deep, unshakable moral conviction, divorced entirely from vanity, the pursuit of social media clout, or any form of personal gain.
And third,
The ultimate aim of the disruption must be public and political reform.
meaning it cannot be an act of private vengeance against a specific corrupt police officer or a specific biased judge. It has to be an attempt to alter the architecture of the system for the benefit of everyone.
Exactly. It is a systemic critique, not a personal vendetta. Fourth, as we stressed heavily with the guardrails, less disruptive means must be demonstrably unavailable or wholly inadequate.
The legal institutional channels have to be verifiably blocked, structurally ineffective, or far too slow to stop an impending irreversible harm.
Yes. Fifth, the response must be strictly proportionate to the injustice.
Let's explore proportionality, because I think it's where movements often fracture. Let's use a mechanical metaphor instead of a medical one.
Okay, I like metaphors.
Proportionality is like a circuit breaker in an electrical grid. If there is a dangerous surge of power in one specific room of a house, you trip the circuit breaker for that room to stop the fire. You don't take a sledgehammer and destroy the entire municipal power plant.
Right, that would be completely disproportionate.
The goal of civil disobedience is to interrupt the specific flow of the injustice without plunging the entire society into permanent darkness. If the injustice is a discriminatory seating policy on a public transit system, you sit in the forbidden seat and refuse to move. You do not place explosives under the bus.
That circuit breaker analogy perfectly captures the essence of proportionality. The form, scope, and intensity of the disobedience must be meticulously calibrated to fit the moral urgency and the specific nature of the wrong being protested. Overreaching destroys the moral high ground.
That makes total sense. What's the sixth condition?
Sixth, as we discussed in the definition phase, there must be a transparent willingness to bear the legal consequences. This is the ultimate proof of sincerity.
Taking the punishment is the receipt that proves you aren't just trying to get away with a crime. It proves you are engaging in a dialogue, not an escape.
And the final condition, which ties deeply into the historical tradition of this practice, is that the act must stringently avoid unnecessary harm to innocents. This is paramount. If you are claiming to break the law in the name of elevated justice, you absolutely cannot create new collateral injustices against innocent bystanders to make your point.
Which brings us to the most critical defining boundary of the entire concept, the role of nonviolence. The source texts specifically and repeatedly highlight that traditional civil disobedience is inherently and inextricably tied to nonviolent action. Why is that specific distinction the linchpin of the whole philosophy?
Because nonviolence is the impenetrable line that separates civil disobedience from armed insurrection, terrorism, or coercive domination. When an actor uses violence, even for a righteous cause, they are abandoning the realm of moral persuasion.
They're just forcing compliance.
Exactly. They are attempting to force their will upon others through the infliction of physical fear, pain, and harm. But nonviolent disobedience communicates something entirely different on a psychological level.
What does it communicate?
It says to the oppressor and the public, I absolutely refuse to cooperate with this injustice, and I will use my body to block its gears, but I am still appealing to the shared conscience of this community. I am trying to persuade your humanity, not conquer your body.
You were demanding that they recognize your shared humanity rather than just overpowering them and forcing their submission.
There is a remarkably profound, almost haunting phrase in the source text regarding the mechanics of this. It states that nonviolence is the only method that allows for strong, unyielding resistance without reproducing the very logic of domination it opposes.
Wow. Let's let that breathe for a second. Without reproducing the very logic of domination. That is the trap of violent revolution, isn't it?
It is.
If you use violence, fear, and domination to overthrow an unjust system, you haven't actually defeated the concept of domination. You've just successfully put yourself in charge of it. You become the new driver, using the same violent vehicle, just heading for a different cliff. Nonviolence is the only way to actually break the cycle entirely.
It is a complete cognitive short circuit for the oppressor. It maintains the absolute moral high ground and physically forces the oppressive state to reveal its own inherent violence in response to your peaceful, disciplined refusal.
Right, the contrast is what does the work.
When the state uses batons against people who are simply sitting quietly and refusing to move, the state's legitimacy evaporates in real time. It is a profoundly difficult, intensely disciplined moral stance. Now, to be thorough, the texts do add a narrow caveat.
Oh, what's the caveat?
They note that in extreme apocalyptic situations, like resisting a genocidal dictatorship resistance, might necessarily move beyond classic nonviolent civil disobedience into armed resistance. But within the core functional concept of a society governed by law, nonviolence is what gives civil disobedience its unique, persuasive moral power.
So bringing all of these incredibly complex, dense philosophical threads together, we started this deep dive with a mission to answer a very specific, uncomfortable question based on these sources.
Yes, we did.
When the law itself is the architect of injustice, is civil disobedience just an admirable choice? Or is it a moral duty?
And by synthesizing every layer the texts have provided, from the baseline need for order to the dangers of complicity, we arrive at a remarkably nuanced, heavily conditioned answer. Is it a duty? Under the right conditions, yes.
It is a duty.
Yes. When laws or institutions become gravely, structurally unjust, and when your continued obedience would force you to become the physical instrument of serious harm or oppression against others, civil disobedience moves far beyond just being an admirable, justified choice. It crosses the threshold into a strict, binding moral responsibility.
But it is never an automatic, unthinking reaction.
Never. It is not an automatic, reflexive response to every political disappointment or policy disagreement. It is heavily, inextricably dependent on the severity of the injustice, the verified failure of normal democratic channels to fix it, a sober calculation of the real-world risks involved, the specific capacity and privilege of the person choosing to act, and whether the act itself remains rigorously proportionate, nonviolent, and morally serious.
You know, this raises an incredibly important question, which I think serves as the ultimate synthesis of this deep dive. The sources make it undeniably clear that we have to strip away the Hollywood glamour and the romanticized mythology surrounding this concept. Civil disobedience is not a fun, rebellious adventure. It is disciplined, excruciating moral refusal. It is the heavy, agonizing realization that some laws simply have lost the right to command our obedience, that some systemic gears must be physically jammed to save the people being crushed inside them, and that there are rare defining moments in history that require citizens to place the demands of justice above the comforts of mere compliance.
The deepest, most resonant truth we can extract from these sources is this core principle. We do not owe the law our blind, unthinking obedience. We owe justice our conscience.
That's the heart of it.
And when the gap between what is legally codified and what is morally just becomes a chasm, the morally serious person may be called upon not just to voice their polite disagreement, but to physically, publicly refuse to participate in the machinery of the wrong.
We do not owe the law blind obedience. We owe justice our conscience. That is a standard that requires relentless, exhausting vigilance from every single one of us. And so I want to turn this directly back to you, the listener, as we wrap up our exploration today.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. Think critically about the spaces you navigate every single day. Think about your workplace, your local community, your digital life, the financial and political institutions you interact with and benefit from. Where is that invisible line for you?
Where does it break?
Exactly. If your moment comes and legality and justice suddenly violently break apart and speed off in opposite directions, would you even recognize it? Would you see the cliff approaching in time? And perhaps far more importantly, Thinking back to our bouncer standing at the door, what specific daily comforts, what level of societal predictability and personal safety are you personally prepared to risk to ensure that you aren't the one quietly, politely holding the door open for injustice?